The cell door banged open. 2 armed men stepped in with a lamp that cut the darkness, and a child was dragged forward by the wrist. The woman on the pallet woke with a scream trapped in her throat. The pallet was aboard with a thin, rotting mattress. The floor smelled of urine and mould. She pushed herself up despite the pain in her limbs. They did not come to kill her yet. They came to take what she could not bear to lose. She clawed at the nearest guard. He shoved her back, rough hands on her shoulders, the smell of his breath and tobacco in her face. She shouted for them to stop and for the boy to be left alone. The child reached for her and called Mama, in a voice too small for the room. The guards laughed and tightened the rope. The lamp revealed a face gone hollow, hair white at the roots, cheeks hollow, eyes rimmed with crimson. There was no privacy. 2 sentries watched from behind a screen. Their orders were simple: observe, report, deny. They moved the boy out into the corridor, and with every step his cries became smaller. The woman slumped back on the mattress and let the sound of the key in the lock be the last thing she heard in that cell. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. The scene that opened the night had been repeated in different forms across prisons, but this was not a generic detainee. The woman had been queen. Her name and title had once made men bow and governments rearrange themselves. Now she existed as a body to be inspected, as rumour and as example. To understand the enormity of what she endured, one must follow the narrowing path that brought her from gilded halls into those damp stones. She had been born an archduchess in an imperial house with arranged marriage, and later thrust into the French court as consort to a king who lacked will and carried the crown like a burden. Versailles was a world of protocol and performance. It had shaped her gestures, her speech, even her habits. She had been accused of extravagance and indifference, and those accusations fed a transformed French language that equated her name with excess. But the charges levelled against her when she became a prisoner were not only about spending. They included treason, correspondence with foreign courts, and finally the most vicious accusation that could be imagined: crimes against her own children. The record of what followed is plain, and the plainness is part of its horror. Deprivation, isolation, staged humiliations, and sustained attempts to break a person into pieces that a crowd could recognise and punish. After the royal household fell into the hands of revolutionaries, the family was moved under guard to a building that had once been a fortress. The Tuileries, the palace, the salons, all became part of the public record of loss. Guards who months earlier had taken orders now took revenge. The Queen watched the palace emptied of its servants, the rooms that had meant protocol and image converted into evidence. Her children did not understand how the world had narrowed. The eldest daughter tried to keep a schedule, to read and embroider. The youngest, barely a child, clung to the routine that had kept him from panic. For a time, the family remained together in the cramped quarters. There was dignity in the small domestic acts. A lesson read aloud, a needle passing through fabric, a shared piece of bread. Those moments did not reverse public momentum. The machinery of revolution required visible victories, and private grief meant little. When the king was carried away from the public square to his place of execution, the sentence registered on the Queen as a wound that would not close. She was not present for the killing. She listened to the sound, a noise that would be repeated in histories as the death knell of monarchy. From that moment she became untethered from any role that might protect her. She was no longer an equal actor in politics. She was evidence in a new narrative of popular justice. The months that followed were marked by a steady, institutional narrowing of the Queen's world. The family was transported from one holding place to another. The prison known as the Temple offered rooms that tried to hold the remnants of the royal household together, but custody under revolutionary watch was custody without kindness. Sentries replaced footmen, meal schedules replaced banquets. Supervision became surveillance. Small cruelties accumulated. The Queen, once used to silk and perfumes, found herself rationing bread and tearing at a wound in her side without medicine. Her hair began to lose pigment as stress and malnutrition took hold. She wrote letters to friends and foreign relatives that were intercepted. Every line could be read as correspondence with enemies. Her children, exposed to the whims of those in power, suffered not only lack of comforts but explicit instruction meant to discredit their lineage. The revolutionary government, eager to display its power, treated them as objects whose public humiliation would validate the regime. The Queen tried to shield her children from horror, but the state moved with a logic that treated family as a political target rather than a private bond. In those constrained rooms, the old hierarchies had been upended, but a new order of arbitrary cruelty had been installed. Isolation intensified as the calendar turned. Prisons across the city filled with those labelled enemies, and the procedures hardened. The Queen heard of laws passed to expedite trials, to make the removal of suspected counter-revolutionaries a public task. She and her surviving family were increasingly excluded from the small mercies that had been available early on. Visits from sympathetic acquaintances, small comforts from old retainers, petitions that might otherwise slip through official review. Instead, they experienced the blunt instrument of state control. Guards were instructed to record every word and to report even the faintest deviation from expected behaviour. The Queen's body registered these pressures, swelling from a lack of proper food, infections from wounds left untreated, and an unmanageable menstrual bleeding that went without medical care. The humiliation in these conditions was deliberate. The prison authorities understood the symbolic power in displaying a fallen sovereign in a state that reduced her to the base necessities of life. Outside, pamphlets and cartoons circulated that depicted her as a decadent monster. Inside, men with simple authority reduced her daily life to routine exposure. The gap between what she had been and what she now was widened not only in appearance but in how others were permitted to talk about and act toward her. The revolutionary press amplified the images of decay and of moral rot attributed to the Queen. Writers who had once criticised the monarchy now penned invective aimed at a single figure who could be pinned for everything the old order had done wrong. The rhetoric hardened public appetite for display. Caricatures circulated with obscene jokes and false claims. Those fed into the attitudes of jailers who adopted mockery as routine. Within the prison, men assigned to watch her blurred the line between duty and cruelty. One guard made comments about her body, another demanded explanations about her private routines. The guards' names appear in records. A young man who practiced mock compassion until it became mockery. Another who laughed when she failed to keep up with imposed hygiene. Voices that once deferred to a crown now used their proximity as power. The Queen's attempt to respond with composed statements was undermined by the physical condition that deprived her of clear memory and steady speech. Sleep deprivation and pain led to gaps in recall. These lapses were turned into evidence at later interrogations. The social mechanism at work was methodical. Degrade, then use the degradation as proof of guilt. In the early phase of escalated control, the state's agents began to separate children from their parents when they judged it necessary to re-educate the next generation. The Queen's youngest son was taken from his mother's arms in a raid meant to break attachment and to repurpose the child into a symbol of the new order. The child's name was Louis Charles, called by royalists with the style he would never fully hold. He was a boy of simple habits, frightened and confused. The taking of the child was not a private act. It was a public display of authority. The Queen resisted with the force she had left. She scratched, bit, shouted. She feared not only for his safety, but for the way his removal severed the last tether of ordinary family life. After the boy was forced away, the Queen's cries echoed in corridors where other prisoners heard and could not help. The child was given to a man named Antoine Simon, identified in records as a tradesman and a man of low repute whom authorities used as an instrument of humiliation. Simon's task was clear: re-educate the child to teach him contempt for his parents and to force public confessions that delegitimized the monarchy. The method was systematic and cruel: hunger, insults, forced performance, and the repeated inculcation of false narratives. The psychological violence of making a child denounce his mother and the public reading of such confessions violated the private sphere in a way that amplified the state's victory. Reports from those who later testified about these events describe a boy reduced to a shell. He learned obscene songs and crude phrases about his family. He was forced to participate in performances that mocked royal rituals. Those who observed Simon's custody of the child noted physical neglect and exposure to vulgar influences intended to distort his sense of self. The intent was not merely to punish the mother, it was to make the child into an instrument of propaganda. The image of a son denouncing his mother could be printed and displayed as incontrovertible proof for readers inclined to believe that the monarchy had bred corruption. In private, the Queen learned of each new humiliation through second-hand reports and through interrogations that leveraged false confessions obtained under pressure. She was told her son had confessed to acts that were impossible for his age, and that he had been trained to accuse her of monstrous behaviours. These lies were convenient political tools. They did not need to be true. They only needed to be plausible enough to sway a public willing to accept the worst. The use of a child in this way deepened the cruelty, converting a family wound into state propaganda. The Queen's health deteriorated visibly. Without consistent medical attention, what may have been a tumour or cervical cancer progressed unchecked. She experienced continuous bleeding and pain. The small rations of food and the constant cold undermined any recovery. She was required to perform the most private acts under observation. Guards watched her wash and dress. The humiliation was designed to eliminate any remnant of dignity. Staff records and later memoirs describe the cramped cell where she was moved in the prison known as the conciergerie. The room was below ground, with damp permeating the stone and a persistent smell that could not be washed away. 2 guards were posted behind a screen at all times. The Queen's clothing hung loose on her. She lost weight and slept poorly. In daylight hours she tried to keep routine, reading, writing letters that would be intercepted, knitting when she could, but the tasks were less to pass time than to maintain a sense of self. When the bleeding would not stop, there was no real treatment. Cloths were changed infrequently, and the materials given were rough. Infection set in. She developed fever and weakness. Those charged with custody claimed they were following orders. Some claimed they felt uncomfortable but were doing their duty. The institutional defence for neglect was predictable and bureaucratic. The state had limited resources and must serve the general will. The moral accounting of what was permitted vanished in that calculus. Female prisoners and staff later described the constant commentary and jokes that accompanied her confinement. Men in positions of minor authority used her body as a subject of conversation. A young guard named Gilbert appears in personal accounts as someone who crossed the line from supervision to sexual harassment. He asked lewd questions and offered help with washing in exchange for favours. Another guard, Dufresne, is named as an accomplice in mockery. These men acted with impunity because their behaviour was tolerated by superiors or because the system did not prioritise protecting someone stripped of rank. The Queen's attempts to set boundaries were met with threats and indifference. Beyond the direct sexual harassment, there was a systematic effort to occupy her mind with rumours and lies about her children. She was told that her son was dead, that her daughter had been violated. Pamphlets mocking her circulated in public and were read aloud by men who aimed to humiliate her. The prison's design made privacy impossible. Every ordinary bodily function became a public scene. The sustained nature of these intrusions did not merely injure her physically, it pursued the deliberate aim of erasing any private identity remaining within her. The revolutionary justice apparatus prepared cases against prominent figures in quick succession. The Queen's name appeared on lists for prosecution. The trials were short, with evidence often drawn from rumour and coerced testimony. The system moved faster than any meaningful defence. When the Queen finally faced the tribunal, she encountered prosecutors who had built careers on attacking aristocracy. The prosecutor who took a lead role in her case had published invective and now relished the chance to cross the threshold from pamphleteer to judge. The charges were manifold: conspiracy with foreign powers, misuse of state funds, and the most explosive allegation, incest. The incest charge relied on the boy's false statements and on the willingness of some to conflate a mother's closeness with moral crime. Legal counsel for the Queen was limited. Her defence sought to dispel the fabrications and to argue that claims made under duress and in a climate of fear were unreliable. Yet the tribunal operated under a different logic: speedy conclusion and exemplary punishment. In the courtroom, the Queen was subject to public humiliation. The spectators filled the benches with varying motives. Some sought spectacle, others sought retribution. The judge's eyes measured not only the law but the crowd. The penalty would not merely be punitive, it would be instructive. The Queen attempted to present a calm account of her actions, to rebut charges with specifics she remembered. But the months without sleep and with pain had left their mark on cognition. She faltered in dates and could not recall particulars with the precision demanded. The prosecutors seized on these lapses. They turned misplaced recollection into evidence of guilt. The boy's coerced statement, read aloud, produced a reaction in the room that blurred outrage with revulsion. Even among hardened revolutionaries, the nature of the accusation caused stomachs to turn. For a moment, sympathy flickered among some women present, who began to weep. The Queen appealed to that instinct. She asked women to consider whether any mother could commit such acts. The appeal produced a pause, but public and political forces closed ranks quickly. The tribunal's aim was not purely adjudicative, it was performative. A verdict would be a signal to other would-be defenders of the old order. The jury, pressured by the climate, deliberated briefly. Guilty verdicts were announced on a series of charges that together built a narrative. If one was guilty, all were proof of systemic intent. The sentence pronounced was death by the state instrument the revolution had adopted. The days before execution magnified the routines of humiliation. Her hair was cut roughly by the executioner. The act was not merely practical but symbolic, to strip her of the last traces of status. Her registration as condemned person reduced her history to a file entry, a list of charges and an execution date. Authorities arranged the physical details with a mixture of professional efficiency and deliberate sting. She was given a thin white dress to wear, the costume of the condemned, and told that she would be transported through public streets to the execution site. The preparations were intended to display the power of the state over the most visible symbols of the old hierarchy. Men who had once been servants of court protocol now supervised the execution of ceremony in its reversed form. The Queen wrote letters in the small hours to family and to a sister who had remained loyal. She tried to preserve her voice on paper, where it could not be intercepted in the same way. Some of those letters were seized, others saved by sympathetic hands. The condemned woman ate little. The final meals were offered more for form than for nourishment. The nights were long, and the guards remained alert to any sign of rebellion among other prisoners. The public appetite for spectacle meant that the procession route was monitored to manage crowd behaviour. The state wanted the execution to be seen as lawful and serene, not as a chaotic revenge. The carriage that would carry her to the square was not gilded. It was a plain cart, a visual statement that the ancien regime had no more right to ceremony. The route was packed with onlookers who hurled insults and slurs. Food vendors worked the crowds, treating the event as another market day. Some spectators came with political fervour, others came out of curiosity. For the condemned, the journey offered a final, brutal catalogue of places once familiar: the palace facades, the river banks, the streets where she had once passed in triumph. Each landmark now marked loss. When the cart finally reached the execution site, the platform and blade were arranged with the same clinical precision of many such public deaths. The executioner performed his task with practised hands, the condemned's clothing removed and replaced, the neck bared, the strap secured. Her last words were an apology to the executioner for stepping on his foot, a small remnant of the manners instilled by a lifetime in court. The blade fell with a sound recorded as a dull, definitive end. The body was carried away and buried among many in a common pit. The state had completed its public act. The revolutionary calendar recorded another point of closure, even as private grief and historical debate continued. After the execution, the physical remains were treated without ceremony. The burial in a common grave was intentional, to prevent a focus of veneration and to underscore the levelling promise of the revolution. For years, the exact location remained vague. The bones of those executed were mixed with other remains. It was only decades later, after restoration of the monarchy, that efforts were made to locate the remains of the former rulers. The search was imperfect and controversial. Pieces believed to belong to the royal couple were identified by their relative size and by circumstantial markers, then reinterred with ritual in a royal basilica. Critics have debated the certainty of those identifications, but the political act of reclaiming remains was itself a statement. Bodies could be reassigned significance by later governments. For the family, the dead would be gathered not by the public who had cheered, but by those who wished to restore memory and honour. The burial and reburial of remains shows how history negotiates physical traces with political meaning. Bones could not undo the months of humiliation, nor could ritual replace the private moments lost in the years before capture. Memory moved in different registers: public record, family testimony, and the slow recovery of documents that had been suppressed or destroyed. The surviving daughter endured exile and a life that preserved constant memory of the family's end. She wrote accounts and memoirs with the clarity of someone trying to fix a narrative that had been distorted by propaganda. Her testimony became important for historians, offering details about the household's final months, about the personal care that was withheld, and about the specific abuses. She never forgave the state that had executed her kin, and that had permitted the humiliation of the living, yet even her writings show the limits of personal reconstruction. Memory is precise in some particulars and fogged in others. She remembered certain gestures, the texture of a shawl, the cadence of a child's laugh, but her account also carried the imprint of decades of grief and a political stance aimed at vindication. Public opinion shifted over time. What had been hysteria and celebration in one year became, in another, source material for remorse and debate. The daughter's life illustrates how the human subjects of historical events live on after their public function has ended, carrying the private burdens that the public has rewritten. The men who had orchestrated the prosecutions and who had inflamed public sentiment did not all survive the revolution they helped lead. Internal purges and shifting alliances claimed many architects of the terror. The prosecutor who had led the charge against the Queen was himself later swept into the system of accusation. The fall of prominent revolutionaries underscores a central irony. A movement that justified itself through purges and exemplary punishments turned on its own. Some of those who had advocated for the greatest penalties found themselves judged by the same instruments. Violence replicated itself within the structures the revolution had built. This cycle of accusation and execution points to a structural dynamic. When a political project grounds itself in the removal of enemies without consistent legal safeguards, the categories of enemy can expand until membership in them is arbitrary. The Queen's fate fits within that wider argument. She was a visible target, and her public destruction served rhetorical and political objectives, but the machinery set in motion did not remain contained. It expanded back on those who had believed themselves protected by its logic. The later fate of many prominent revolutionaries, including the architect who centralized the instrument of terror, was to be executed in turn. Their trials mirrored earlier ones in procedural haste and rhetorical flourish. The same public crowds that had demanded punitive spectacle sometimes turned away or turned against the instigators as fear and exhaustion spread. Those who once cheered found that revolutionary justice had no secure place to stop. Historians have traced how ideological certainty and the need for enemies produced a culture that consumed its own leaders. The Queen's death became one episode in that history, a dramatic display that magnified the state's claim while also demonstrating the reversibility of such power. The revolution achieved many structural changes. It also produced cycles of retribution that later generations would interpret as tragic excess. Her story remained useful for different sides, for monarchists as proof of revolutionary cruelty, for Republicans as evidence of necessary rupture, and for historians as a case that resists simple moralization. The use of propaganda in the months before trial was deliberate and granular. Pamphlets, plays, and songs painted gross caricatures of the Queen. Printmakers and writers recycled rumours into printed evidence. The aim was to create an image so repulsive it would justify the most severe responses. The allegations about her sexual behaviour, ownership of illicit correspondence, and involvement in treason were amplified and repeated until repetition itself seemed like corroboration. Revolutionary authorities relied on a population hungry for symbols and simplified narratives. Information ecology in a revolutionary city favoured the loudest voice and the most sensational claim. Rumour travelled quickly. Truth required corroboration that the court did not want to wait for. The Queen's personal letters were sometimes published selectively to imply intent. Other documents were altered or presented without context. In this environment, the line between fact and fiction blurred. The prosecution used this environment strategically. The legal proceedings did not merely apply evidence, they moulded public perception by timing revelations to coincide with trials and executions. The state used spectacle as law, and law as spectacle. For those who watched from inside the prison, the printed world had direct consequences. Guards read pamphlets aloud in courtyards. Street slogans entered cells. A legal claim in a paper might become the justification for a new indignity in prison. The Queen's responses, written with shaky hand and limited resources, rarely reached the same audience. Her defence was private and legal, the prosecution was public and performative. This imbalance shaped outcomes. Even those who might have been inclined to sympathy found their judgments sullied by months of saturated negative representations. The state's public message dominated the moral imagination. The tactic was effective because it relied on social instincts. When a community hears the same assertion repeatedly, individual skepticism is eroded. The revolutionaries knew this. They manipulated the channels of information the same way they manipulated institutions, turning social energy towards specific ends. The result for the Queen was that her personal truth was drowned in a chorus of accusation and mockery. The accusation that resonated most painfully was the forced statement attributed to the child. This testimony had been obtained under conditions of coercion and manipulation. Individuals who witnessed the process later testified that the boy had been coached, starved, and taunted until he repeated words placed in his mouth. The legal culture of the time struggled with the weight of such testimony, because courts were structured to accept oral statements as powerful evidence. The Revolutionary Tribunal exploited that tendency. The presentation of the child's statement in court functioned not merely as evidence, but as a moral condemnation that justified the final sentence in the eyes of many observers. For the Queen, the claim was a breach that could not easily be repaired. Accusations about sexual abuse cut deeper than political betrayal. Even those who accepted other charges found the alleged intimate crimes hard to stomach. Yet modern historical review has stressed the unreliability of such confessions and the likelihood that the boy's statements reflected the pressures placed upon him, not an accurate account of family life. The record of what happened to the child in subsequent detention, neglect, physical harm, and early death, complicates the moral picture and highlights the system's cruelty to everyone involved. The boy's death in custody at a young age was an outcome of neglect and abuse. Official reports from physicians and later autopsy notes recorded the physical decline, tuberculosis, chronic malnutrition, and the marks of repeated assault. The poignancy of this outcome is harsh. A child died amid claims that made him a central witness in a political prosecution. This fact has been used by multiple historians to underline how revolutions can convert personal tragedies into public instruments. The child's last years reveal a neglected victimhood that was both immediate and symbolic. The preservation of his heart in alcohol by a physician, and its survival through a chain of custodians until it was buried years later, is a grim detail that later generations used to bind together the narrative of familial destruction. The child's body, like his mother's public image, became freight for meaning produced by others. The human reality, that a young life was spent and ended in conditions unfit for a child, remains the clearest indictment of the broader system's failures. The woman assigned to clean the Queen's cell in the last weeks, a servant called Rosalie, stands out in survivor testimonies. She was permitted to bring washing and basic supplies and attempted to give small comforts, soap, clean garments, bandages. Her actions were discreet and in the record almost furtive. She helped change soiled linens and wash the woman's feet when the guards were not watching. Those 20 minutes of human contact meant more than any legal defence. They restored a sense of personhood to someone about to be stripped of everything else. The Queen, who had previously only known staff of higher rank, accepted the help. She cried openly in Rosalie's presence. The cries were recorded by memoirists as a final humanisation before the formal end. Rosalie's gesture did not alter the legal process, but it did create a moment of dignity in a sequence designed to remove dignity. It also left a trace in memory that would be repeated in memoirs and accounts after the events, evidence that even in the most institutionalised cruelty, individual acts of care persisted. Rosalie's later accounts became part of the contested evidence about the Queen's final days. Her testimony described the physical state of the woman, the wounds and the blood, the way she braided white hair and assisted with letters. She reported whispers of hope, and she recorded the Queen's final testaments to family members. These small records aimed to counter the image constructed in pamphlets and cartoons. Rosalie's confidential acts became a form of resistance, a witness who could contradict the public narrative of monstrous excess with a private testimony of human suffering. Her presence shows how ordinary actors in the revolutionary apparatus could choose to exercise mercy. even when the system around them encouraged cruelty. That choice mattered. It left an account that later historians could weigh against propaganda and official records, and allowed a more nuanced view to survive. The trial's architecture deserves attention. It was compact and designed to move cases quickly. The judges were men with strong political ties to committees that governed public safety. They conducted proceedings with procedural forms, but the judicial norms were compressed by a political urgency that privileged speed and theatrical closure. The Queen, brought before the bench, was asked to answer charges in a setting that combined legalism with spectacle. The record shows the nervousness in the room. Some observers whispered about fairness. Her legal team pressed procedural points that were routinely ignored. The crowd outside waited for the outcome because the trial's result was an event and not just a verdict. The state required a narrative of rupture. The tribunal's operative principle was not fair adjudication but public pedagogy. The law was a tool to instruct the populace about the boundaries of acceptable conduct. In these circumstances, legal niceties, such as the chain of custody of documents or the conditions under which a child's testimony was produced, were subordinated to the political demand for visible results. The Queen herself understood the precariousness of the situation. She attempted to speak plainly and to make appeals that would resonate in the courtroom's moral imagination. She addressed women in the public gallery and asked them whether a mother could commit the crimes alleged. That appeal had an effect. Some listeners wept. But the momentum of the trial, along with the prior months of propaganda, reduced the impact of such appeals. The court had already constructed a narrative arc. An admission or denial would be read through the frame of guilt established by public discourse. The verdict, when delivered, seemed inevitable to many observers. It confirmed the state's desire to translate political change into definitive moral terms. The sentence was carried out without delay. The rapidity between sentence and execution illustrates how the revolutionary justice system prioritized exemplarity over deliberation. The formality of an execution can be described in clinical terms: the measurement of the platform, the securing of the condemned, the lowering of the blade, and the removal of the body. Yet those technical elements were wrapped in social meaning. The crowd's presence turned the act into a public ritual meant to consolidate a new order. Vendors and throngs treated the day as a market of sensation. Some participants felt righteous, others felt passive curiosity. For the condemned, the body endured humiliation and exposure in equal measure. Conditions had already reduced the individual to a body to be displayed. The state intended this exposure to be the ultimate levelling. The aristocratic body made common, the former queen turned to refuse. The statist logic was simple. Show the population that no status could prevent the state's reach. But that very logic exposed the limits of a political project that could not both claim moral superiority and enact brutal spectacles. Following the death, the state pursued a line of administration that sought to render the event into a clear chapter in revolutionary history, cataloguing the executed and publishing proclamations about the triumph of the people. The act was described in bulletins and newspapers. Officials framed the killing as part of a larger program of cleansing the nation from corrupt elements. For some contemporaries, the execution had the expected effect. It impressed fear and clarified alliances. For others, it seeded doubts about the use of terror as a political tool. The immediate aftermath produced debates in private salons and in public spaces about whether the revolution had become indistinguishable from the tyranny it replaced. That debate would continue in memoirs, histories, and political thought. The event acquired symbolic density. It could be invoked by different parties to support opposing claims. The physical traces of the Queen's last weeks, letters, garments, and the testimony of servants, circulated as evidence in later years. Collectors and libraries accumulated correspondence that offered a counterpoint to the smear campaigns. These items allowed historians to reconstruct a timeline and to ask medical and forensic questions about health and cause of death. The Queen's clothing, in particular, became object lessons. The white dress of the condemned, the rough undergarments used in a cell, the bandages described in accounts. Such artifacts testify to the material reality of humiliation. They became objects through which later generations could assess the level of neglect and indignity imposed. Museums and private collections later displayed fragments, and the physicality of these items helped shape the public's comprehension of what had occurred in a way that printed invective never could. Scholars have used these material traces to frame inquiries about medical conditions that were ignored. The persistent bleeding and signs of infection recorded in memoirs and in Rosalie's testimony suggest a serious gynecological issue that went untreated. Historians and medical experts suspect a malignancy. Without proper care, such conditions can cause chronic pain, severe anemia, and cognitive impairment, symptoms that match contemporary descriptions. Such an analysis complicates the moral picture. What appears as willful stoicism or confusion in court may have been related to untreated illness. Recognizing the role of health shifts some responsibility back onto the custodial institutions that denied care. The question is not merely diagnostic, it is ethical. A state that abandons medical responsibility for prisoners contributes to suffering beyond punishment. The Queen's physical decline cannot be separated from the institutional choices that allowed it. The Queen's case has been invoked in political debate since the moment of her death. Monarchists used her execution as proof of revolutionary excess. Republicans sometimes argued that such acts, though regrettable, were necessary steps in a larger emancipatory project. Historians have not settled on a single moral verdict, but the facts of institutional cruelty are clear. The extraction of children from parents, the use of coerced testimony, the withholding of medical care, and the public transformation of a human being into a spectacle are practices that can be judged on empirical grounds. They are reproducible in records and testimony. The interpretive work then becomes one of situating these facts in a broader argument about revolution, justice, and the limits of state violence. The Queen's fate shows how political aims can eclipse legal norms, and how the rhetoric of virtue can be invoked to justify brutal measures. That paradox ensures the story retains modern relevance in questions about security and human rights. Later generations have sought to mine the case for lessons about legal protections. The revolutionary period mobilized laws that allowed expedited trials and executions. Those legal mechanisms prioritized popular will over procedural safeguards. Modern legal scholars have pointed to such systems as examples of how emergency powers can be abused. The Queen's experience offers a human counterweight. A person reduced by law and by rumour became an object of punishment that outstripped what could be justified by evidence. The lesson is institutional. The structure that permits accelerated punishment also permits error and cruelty. This point has been used to argue for legal safeguards in modern systems, reminding readers that the preservation of rights forms part of the moral architecture of any polity. The case is thus both historical and prescriptive. Memory politics shaped the rehabilitation of the Queen's image. After the restoration of monarchy, efforts were made to recover bodies and reframe narratives. The daughter and other survivors pushed for reburial and for documentation that would reclaim dignity. These acts were not mere sentiment. They were political gestures aimed at reversing the symbolic damage done in the revolutionary years. Museums and memorials later framed scenes of captivity and humiliation in ways that invited pity and outrage, aligning the Queen's fate with broader themes of martyrdom. These forms of commemoration were selective and served political aims, but they also restored a measure of privacy and honour that the punitive state had stripped away. The politics of memory shows how those in power after the fact can reassign meaning to past events, often smoothing over the complexities and amplifying certain truths while leaving others in shadow. The reburial and the official restoration of royal dignity were accompanied by cultural productions, biographies, portraits, and plays that reinterpreted the last months as a narrative of victimhood and resistance. These cultural responses sought to humanize the Queen and to challenge the caricatures that had circulated during the Revolution. They provided evidence to counter the printed lies, while also participating in myth-making. The public that consumed these works could learn both about cruelty and about the danger of simple narratives. Memory became a contested field where families, states, and artists negotiated who would inherit the emotional truth of the events. The Queen's story became a symbol mobilized by different interests, and the mobilization itself is a historical fact that must be accounted for. The personal legacies of those closest to the Queen deserve attention. Madame Elizabeth, the Queen's sister-in-law who remained loyal to the royal household, was herself executed later. Her presence in family narratives became part of the collective trauma. The surviving daughter lived a life shaped by trauma, exile, and the responsibility to testify. These personal stories are not merely footnotes. They help us understand the human toll of political ruptures. The family members who survived carried the memory of the child's last cries and the mother's final letter. That burden affected how they lived, how they spoke, and how they engaged with politics. Trauma transmits across generations, not only as recollection, but as behavioural patterns and institutional distrust. The Queen's story therefore links private suffering with social consequences that lasted well beyond the immediate political moment. The physician who conducted the autopsy on the boy and the officials who handled remains also left records that historians have used to reconstruct the last days. These documents are blunt, lists of symptoms, notes on bodily state, and inventories that reveal the cold administrative side of death. The dispassionate nature of such records paradoxically humanizes the victims. The same documents that reduce a person to items can later be read for clues about cruelty and neglect. Historians must navigate between the official tone of such records and the human stories they point to. The bureaucratic residue of the revolutionary years, inventories, court transcripts, and prison logs, provides the materials through which the past can be reassembled into a narrative that respects fact without moralizing simplistically. Scholars continue to debate the balance between political necessity and human cost. The Queen's death is a test case in those debates. Some argue that the revolutionary government faced relentless threats and that extraordinary measures were required to secure the state. Others counter that the measures employed, quick trials, punitive spectacle, and a culture of denunciation, produced avoidable cruelty that undermined the moral authority of the cause. These debates matter because they inform how contemporary societies think about emergency powers and the ethical limits of political violence. The past is not a set of sealed lessons but a resource for present decision-making. The Queen's suffering, documented in the record, invites contemporary readers to weigh whether political ends ever justify the systemic degradation of persons. The archival record shows that choices were available, alternatives were possible, longer proceedings, more careful scrutiny of testimonies, and humane treatment of prisoners as matters of policy. That such alternatives were not pursued indicates a political will to demonstrate dominance above all else. The revolution had rhetorically committed itself to the people, but its practices sometimes contradicted that commitment by treating certain bodies as expendable. The practical lesson is institutional, when legal frameworks allow for the discrimination of rights and for accelerated punishments, they create conditions for abuse. This recognition does not resolve the larger historical questions about revolution's necessity, but does clarify the causal links between policy choices and human harm. The final portion of this account returns to the human core. The months before execution had transformed a woman who had been seen in portraits and court sketches into a patient in a cell where men watched her change bandages and wash. The banality of those acts, the folding of cloth, the braiding of hair, the slow removal of dead tissue, contrasts with the enormity of the public spectacle that followed. The domestic, private moments remained the real measure of suffering. The last minutes with a child, the quiet acceptance of a letter never to be read by its intended recipient, the small mercies offered by a single servant. These items form the residue of a life not reducible to caricature. They remind us that historical actors are persons with fragility, vulnerabilities, and attachments that persist despite politics. In the end, the record insists on a final truth that resists easy moralization. A political project that devotes its energy to representation and purging of enemies can achieve its immediate aims, but it will also leave a trail of human devastation. The Queen's removal from power and subsequent public destruction accomplished a political signal, yet it cost lives, dignity, and the cohesion of a society fractured by vengeance. The last weeks she lived were designed to strip her of privacy, to degrade her body, and to force her into a spectacle that justified state violence. That measured cruelty, the slow, calculated ruin of a person before the final act, is the central horror. It is worse than the blade because it stretches suffering across time and exposes the suffering to public consumption. We record these facts not to inflame but to remember. When institutions abandon restraint and treat people as instruments of political pedagogy, the moral fabric of public life is damaged in ways that outlast any single regime.